There's actually a reality that's going to descend on Europe within the next 2 to 3 weeks. And this is the fallout from the shutdown of the Persian Gulf and Iran closing off the Strait of Hormuz. So, there has been a dramatic loss of five significant, I'll call them commodities, but they are inputs into the global economy. At least 20% of the oil, 25% of the liquid natural gas, 25 to 30% of the sulfur and urea, which go for fertilizer, and over 40% of the helium, which is used for making computer chips, among other things. Well, right now, on the oil front, the United States is within 2 weeks will essentially have run out of having a reserve supply of diesel and aviation fuel. So they won't have enough oil, the heavy or sour crude that's required to make diesel and aviation fuel. It'll be sort of week to week, depending upon what they can receive, because the United States is already a net importer of that. Well, the same for Europe. Europe is a net importer of all classes of oil, and the shortages that are going to come will affect the economies dramatically. They're already sort of barely bumping along, staying, maybe slightly above zero, but we're talking now that it'll be recession, if not depression territory. And oddly enough, Donald Trump talked about this 2 weeks ago at the G7, and I think that helped explain why he signed the MOU, because he recognized in 4 weeks, we could be running on zero as far as the kind of crude oil that's needed to produce diesel and aviation fuel. So Europe is in a worse situation than the United States, because the United States at least has some is independent, produces enough of the light oil that is used to produce gasoline. And it's actually been shipping some of that to Europe as well. But Europe doesn't have that. And it's on the issue of the heavy crude, the middle distillates part of the oil from which you get diesel and aviation fuel. And that's going to be a critical shortage here. And we're not talking months, we're talking weeks. So we're going to have a dramatic, differently looking world probably by July 15.
Yeah, now a great time for Europe to engage in a direct war with the world's largest nuclear power, it seems.
Who also has ample supplies of oil and gas.
Yeah, well, that's the big irony here. The assumption by the Europeans that they would, if they just cut all the ties with Russia, then the Russian economy would collapse relatively shortly. I still make the point on as soon as they announced initially these sanctions, I was making the point that this is going to fail, because I worked in Moscow. I worked on on a program or initiative or a department that worked on this whole shift of Russia's economy from the west to the east. That's what I mostly work on as well. And I knew that the Russians had made essentially their economy bulletproof. They were shifting their economy quickly to the east, and any sanctions would only be used as an opportunity to intensify this process. Right. So I knew that the Russians could diversify away from Europe, but Europe couldn't diversify away from Russia. But whenever I made this point, I was told, well, that undermines trust in public support in the sanctions. So that's a pro-Russian comment, and that makes you a Putinist. So this is the level of debate we have in Europe, and it is beyond ridiculous. But anyways, my point is, all of this cheap Russian gas and oil, which used to go to Europe, now goes to Asia. And as the Germans have begun to experience, their companies are following the Russian gas. When the gas goes to China, the German company packs up and go there as well. So it's stupid on a lot of levels. I do want to ask about Marco Rubio in Anchorage, though, he made the point now that, well, what happened in Anchorage wasn't really a deal. It was more, discussing formats, something that the Kremlin did not care much for.
No, well, it's just Rubio is an incompetent. His job as a Secretary of State, National Security Advisor, at least to use the last one to really occupy that role was Henry Kissinger. And while Henry Kissinger may have been a war criminal, there's no denying the man had intellect and thought in strategic terms. Sometimes he was a devious, evil bastard. There's no doubt about that. But he reckoned, his telling Nixon, okay, we're going to go to China. We're going to reestablish relationships with communist China. Something you, Nixon, if you fought against communism you made your career on that. We're doing that because we want to weaken the Soviet Union, and we want to make sure that we split China off from that branch of communism and help the Chinese develop if you will, a dependence upon us in the West. So there was clear strategic thinking behind this. Well, here's Rubio, just like, he views Russia, does not recognize the critical role that Russia is now playing in the creation of a new international economic, political, and military order. This is coming into fruition. The war, just as the Russia's decision to attack Ukraine because of the impending attack from the West, to preempt that, it just as that accelerated the growth of BRICS as an economic power. The U.S. and Israeli attack on Iran's subsequent, if you will, defeat of the U.S. and Israeli attack, in part because of support received from both Russia and China, significant support that ranged from just not just financial aid, weapon systems, ammunition, intelligence, and we saw a recent report that the backseater, the colonel who was flying in the backseat of the F-15 that got shot down south of Isfahan back in April, that he reported seeing these drones, this drone pack, and I don't recall if he said it was attacking his ship or whatever, but it was moving as one. It looked like a jellyfish, but it was moving in a coordinated fashion. Well, that came from China. There's no other country in the world that does that like China does. The Chinese also provided missiles. Pepe Escobar and I learned from our Pakistani source that during some of the retaliatory strikes against Israel and the United States and the use of Chinese missiles, that there were Pakistani technicians, military technicians, trained by the Chinese, sitting with the Iranians, helping them launch and use these weapon systems, which destroyed critical infrastructure for the United States in both Bahrain and Kuwait, and at Muwafiq al-Salti Air Base in Jordan. So what you're seeing now emerge is this new international military. It's going to be a security organization. It's going to be an economic organization, and it's literally an alternative to this U.S. dominated post-World War II hegemonic enterprise. And that's what the United States and Europe, I'm not sure they fully comprehend what's happening, but it's happening. And no matter how much they complain about it or say that it's not real or say that it's weak, they can say all that they want. The fact of the matter is it is happening. And you look at the growth rate for China, they set up this alternative to SWIFT. It's called CIPS, Cross-Border Interbank Payment System, CIPS. SWIFT is it's an analog. It's like using a buggy whip because it's email, it's like I'm Bank A and you're Bank B, and I say, "Dear Glenn, I'm sending you this wire transfer. Please effect it and credit it to this account." And so I send it to you, but it goes into your spam folder and you don't find it for 3 days. Okay, but eventually it would get through. Not with SIPs. It's digital, immediately transfer here, assets move. Number of banks signing up for that have increased. I think the number is like 26 in the last month. So the point of all this is Europe is becoming increasingly irrelevant. They're no, you know, they're not a huge market in terms of the rest of the world. They have been considered a potentially profitable one, although I will note uh, the Chinese are making tremendous inroads in Europe with their electric vehicles. They're cheaper than Tesla. They're better in many aspects. They have better features, and the Europeans don't have an answer to it.
Yeah, no, they don't like it, but they don't know what to do. They keep referring to China as a threat because of it. It's which makes it very difficult because they can't defend their position. I mean, if you want to argue that China's a threat, a country that hasn't been in a war in more than 4 decades, and somehow the threat defined as a military threat derives from its electric vehicles being exported to Europe.
Yeah.
It's quite extraordinary. It was interesting what you mentioned about Kissinger, though, because as you said, he's one who, should take credit for breaking the Chinese off the Soviet Union in the late 70s, but not, yeah, well, in the 70s. But in 2014, Kissinger, he wrote some interesting articles. He was making the point that this is after the NATO countries toppled the government in Kiev, that neither NATO or the Russians should use Ukraine as a front against the other. It should be a bridge. And he also was quite critical of how the Western countries' rhetoric was essentially about defeating Russia instead of finding a formula for having a common security structure, for example. Anyways, I think this is important because he had discussions with Trump in 2016 before Trump took the presidency. And I'm sure he was kind of communicating his own ideas about what to do this time, which is, you see this huge Eurasian giant forming of Russia and China. In economic terms, Russia is now the junior partner. So, reach out to the smaller one, play on its insecurities, and try to bring them over to our side of the ledger, which makes a lot of sense. But, what happened? Well, you had the Russiagate hoax. Trump was a Russian agent. This was kind of the logic,
Yeah.
because you can't say that it's a good idea to get along with Russia. I mean, this is how still the Europeans talk, though, not just the ridiculous people on social media, but it's the politicians, the journalists. This is still the thinking. So it doesn't bode well in terms of, the wider strategic thinking, which we now need. But yeah, my last question was, Russia strikes Europe in retaliation to restore its deterrence. What does the United States do?
United States may want to jump into it, but they won't be able to. What the war with Iran has exposed are the limitations of U.S. military power. Because you have to step back and say, okay, what are we going to do? Um, is our naval force, do we have a naval force that we can send our aircraft carriers up into the Baltic Sea, for example, or into the Black Sea? No, we can't. So you have to, the aircraft carriers really are of no use in a military assault on Russia. So that leaves ground troops. We don't have ground troops. We got 470,000 to quote invade Russia. So we cannot pose a credible ground threat to Russia, or if we were proposing doing that, just the time that would be required to assemble that force in Poland or in Romania, in locations where they could go across the border. The Russians, in the era of drones, short range and intermediate range ballistic missiles, would target and destroy those encampments. So that leaves air power. And, again, what we're running up against now is until the Strait of Hormuz is open and the oil, the 20% of oil that disappeared from the market is back on the market, and that's going to be months, maybe a year or so, then there's not going to be enough aviation fuel to sustain the kind of combat operation that would be required against Russia. And at the same time, the United States calculation that it could engage in attacks on Russia and that its own continental locations would be free. No. As Russia's deployed the Burevestnik atomic cruise missile, Russia will this time would not hesitate to strike sites in the United States. I mean, this is an absolute worst case scenario, nightmare scenario. The reality is the United States has limited military assets. They're very expensive, but we don't have strategic depth with any of them. And what they've discovered, again, with Iran, that, Iran does not have the kind of missile defense systems that Russia does. And Iran survived what the United States unleashed on it. And I would say that Russia carries more potential counterweight, that they're able to respond in greater levels of violence to the United States or the Europeans than Iran could to Israel or the United States in the recent war. So no, it'd be a recipe for suicide, in my view.
Well, it does appear that we are moving towards suicide in Europe, at least. That is, if you hear the hawks now in Moscow, and their voices grow louder every day, and they get more and more people on their side, the argument is essentially go for full mobilization, kill Zelensky, destroy the entire government district in Kiev, and while they're at it, go after all the European plants that build weapons that are used to attack Russia. And if something goes wrong, reach for the tactical nukes.
Yeah.
And again, what's holding all of these hawks back is Putin. And this is the man which the European leaders most of all want to get rid of.
Yeah.
Because he is Hitler. I mean, you couldn't make this up. It's so bizarre, but there is, as you said, there is no logic anymore. It's just pure
it's pure insanity, But they may get what they want, and they won't like what they get. So, hey, let me leave you. I got unrelated to this, but we'll call it breaking news. I have confirmed that the United States, the Central Command through the Joint Chiefs of Staff have issued the order for U.S. all those U.S. military forces that were being deployed into the bases in the Persian Gulf and in Jordan and in Israel. The order is now, they've been issued the order, come home. So you're going to start seeing all of that combat aircraft withdrawn, all the personnel, 82nd Airborne, they're going to be withdrawn. It took more than a month to deploy them, and it's going to take more than a month to redeploy them. But the point is, now that this order to redeploy has been issued, the chances of the United States re-engaging Iran militarily have been reduced significantly.
Well, on those good notes or good news, and there's not much of that recently, we can wrap it up. Hopefully, why not pack up the military bases in Europe as well, send them home, and perhaps then the Europeans become a little bit less cocky and we discover diplomacy. But that's for the future, at least.
From your mouth to God's ears.
Well, thanks again, Larry. It's always great to speak with you.
All right, Glenn. Take care. Bye-bye.